right, good afternoon and welcome to the Foreign Policy Research Institute's event commemorating the 45th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. This is part two of a two-part series. You can catch part one where we featured Matt Pottinger, the former Deputy National Security Advisor. That's up on FPRI's website as well as on YouTube. I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the director of the Asia program at FPRI, and on behalf of the organization, thank you so much to our supporters and members. We couldn't do this kind of programming without you. And for those of you here now, I'll be taking questions for our esteemed guest, so I encourage you to put some, if you're curious, in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm very pleased to introduce the chair of the American Institute in Taiwan, Laura Rosenberger. She's had many illustrious positions in and out of the US government. She has served as the senior director for China in the National Security Council. She was also the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a former senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Chair Rosenberger, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Michael, for having me. Great to be with you.
Well, I thought I'd begin by trying to get a better sense of what's at stake here. In recent years, I think it would be fair to say that Taiwan's international stature has grown in a number of ways. I hear Taiwan being discussed on the news almost every day. You just had this big election that was free and fair. And in the United States, I even notice it in my daily life with friends and family starting to ask about Taiwan. And you've also obviously had delegations of prominent current and former US officials heading over to Taiwan. And so I'm wondering, do you notice a similar trend, and could you speak to that? Like, why does it seem like Taiwan increasingly seems to matter for so many people?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And yeah, I completely agree. I think there's really been a growth in the past few years, in particular, of international attention to Taiwan. And I think that's come in a couple of different forms and for a couple of different reasons. I think one of the reasons, frankly, has just been a real growing understanding of the role that Taiwan plays in the international community. And of course, that's despite the fact that, it's the PRC seeks to restrict its international space and its ability to meaningfully participate in the international system. But we, in the US, we kind of talk about Taiwan as a force for good. And I think some of this really started around the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was, a real strong push by Taiwan early on in the pandemic to send really critical supplies to the United States and to others around the world who were facing really early outbreaks, to make sure that we had masks, to make sure that we had respirators, to make sure that we had all kinds of basic PPE and really necessary goods. That Taiwan really was pushing all that out to the world. And then the model that Taiwan had of handling the pandemic itself, of using tools and technology, but doing so in a way that was consistent with democratic values, doing it in a very democratic and open way, as a way of controlling the spread, I think was also an example for the world of, again, a democratic model of pandemic control and resilience. So I think that was like one marker where people started to really see Taiwan as like, a way to learn things beyond just, the things that everybody knows about in terms of semiconductors and all these other things that people kind of have known. I think, other things, we obviously have seen Taiwan engage in a number of other different efforts across the past few years. I think 2024 has been characterized as the year of elections. There's dozens of elections in democracies across the world, and Taiwan pretty much went first, and I think really set a high bar for the world in terms of the conduct of its elections. 72% turnout. That's of people who have to show up in person to vote in their home areas. That often means either flying back from overseas or traveling back from overseas to vote, or even if you're on the island of traveling to another city to cast your ballot. 72% of registered voters cast those ballots, and they were counted transparently and efficiently, and the results were known just a few hours after polls had closed. And we saw very gracious concession speeches and victory speeches. And I will just note here, as you noted, one of my past roles as the director of the Alliance for Security and Democracy, so I can't help but get a little impassioned and emotional on sort of the real robustness and resilience of Taiwan's democracy, which again, I think is an example to the world, because not only did Taiwan conduct its elections so well in such a free and fair way, but also, Taiwan is a real example of how to deal with challenges like disinformation, which it has seen both in and around its elections, but also on a more persistent basis. So again, I think the world knows there's a lot to be learned from Taiwan. And then, of course, there's the ways in which Taiwan is, an incredibly important economic partner for so many around the world. It's the United States' 8th largest trading partner. We have an incredible amount of two-way investment with Taiwan. I think a lot of, beyond just the immediate region, I think, a lot of countries in Europe are increasingly looking at ways to deepen some of their own economic ties. We've seen investments in the semiconductor space going into Europe, as well as other nearby places like Japan, as well as the United States. So I think those areas as well, the economic ties, the technological ties, all those things I think have really demonstrated to the world how much Taiwan is a value proposition for us. And therefore, of course, why that needs to be protected. And I know I'm going on long, so I will pause in 1 second. But I think, preserving that value proposition, preserving what Taiwan has to offer is really important. And so I think that's why you've seen the growing voices, saying over and over again and expressing, interest in and concern about maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, a key part of that is exactly what we're here to commemorate, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was crafted to ensure that the United States remains committed to supporting Taiwan even after ending official relations with the island. You've served in the National Security Council. You are chair of the American Institute in Taiwan. Can you talk a little bit about how or to what extent the Taiwan Relations Act helps policymakers craft and guide policy? And do you make anything of discussions about modifying aspects of the Taiwan Relations Act going forward?
Yeah, thanks. Well, in addition to being a fangirl for democracy, I'm a fangirl for the Taiwan Relations Act. So love to have a chance to talk about how it interacts with our work. The TRA, I think, as everybody here knows, alongside the 3 joint communiques and the 6 assurances, really guides our One China policy and our robust and continuing broadening and deepening partnership with Taiwan. For 45 years this month, the framework provided by the TRA has enabled U.S. engagement with Taiwan to support Taiwan's growth as everything I just talked about, a beacon of democracy in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world, as a thriving, vibrant economy, a key destination for and source of U.S. investment, and as a technological powerhouse and close friend to the United States. The TRA, to my mind, really has provided a foundation for really everything we are doing to broaden and deepen the relationship. It's a I think a very it provided a lot of insight. It was a very insightful piece of legislation, I guess I should say, even when drafted. For anybody who's really a TRA nerd like me, I've been going back and reading the congressional record, the legislative history of the debates around the TRA, and it's really, really fascinating to look. In many ways, really prescient, and kind of enabling and providing a framework that has endured for so long and allowed for the kind of growth that we have seen both with Taiwan, across the strait, and in the broader Indo-Pacific region. I think oftentimes when people think about the TRA, they think primarily about the commitment to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capacity. And of course, that's a really, really key commitment for the United States. But the TRA has so much more to offer. I mean, first of all, AIT, most of our work is really because of what the TRA empowers us to do, that the U.S. government works by and through AIT for our unofficial relations with Taiwan. And so it's a privilege to be able to do that, and to really carry out the work of the TRA in preserving and promoting the extensive, close and friendly commercial, cultural, and other relations that the TRA envisions. But the TRA also, I think, has a few other key provisions that I'll just sort of note that I think you can see as through lines in our work, right? One is, we talked about the self-defense commitment, or the commitment to provide for Taiwan's self-defense capacity. But the TRA also says that the United States should maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion. And I think that's an important commitment, and you see the United States continuing to do work, both ourselves and with allies and partners in the region, to reinforce deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, to maintain that critical peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. It notes that peace and stability in the area is in the not only political security and economic interests of the United States, but matters of international concern. And again, I think that's the thing that you've really seen, certainly the Biden administration working to build out in joint statements and communiques, and really to underscore that international concern, make it very explicit. And then, of course, it says that the United States would consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means of grave concern to the United States. And again, I think this really underscores the depth and breadth of the provisions of the TRA that have provided an enormous amount of space for the United States in our partnership with Taiwan, all of which consistent with our One China policy.
It's a sweeping law, and as you say, the United States is doing a number of things to try to support Taiwan. But I was really struck because I was looking at some recent polls that suggest, on the one hand, most people in Taiwan definitely want a stronger relationship with the United States. That doesn't seem to be in doubt. But only roughly a third, think the United States right now is what they call a trustworthy partner. For some perspective, in 2021, that number was at 45%. I don't want to put too much stock into polls, but if you ask sort of follow-up questions, people say that they're skeptical of the United States, or a little bit unsure because of things like waffling over the aid to Ukraine, or just the level of polarization in American politics. And so I guess my question is, are Taiwan's people right to have some doubts or worries about the depth of the US commitment to Taiwan? And what, if anything, should the United States be doing to try to not just reaffirm its support for Taiwan, but really show the Taiwanese people that the United States is reliable and will be a solid partner going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We like to say that the U.S. commitment to Taiwan is principled, it's bipartisan, and it's rock solid. And all those things have the virtue of being true. And so, I hope that the Taiwan people can be assured that our commitment is real, and it is, in fact, all of those three things, and that it's an enduring commitment. And again, really, really enabled by the framework of the TRA. We understand that in any democracy, there's, space for debate, including on foreign policy, including on partnerships, and questions like that are not new or different to us, in terms of partnerships around the world. But of course, it is in our deep interest to make sure the Taiwan people feel secure in our commitment and in our support. And that's why this administration has been so focused on continuing to broaden and deepen our partnership, not only in what we're doing in the defense space to support Taiwan's self-defense capacity, where we're broadening our economic ties through initiatives like the 21st Century Trade Initiative that was launched in 2022, and the first agreement was signed last year, which really takes our trade relationship to another level. We're continuing to work on additional chapters, in under that initiative. Promoting two-way investments, not just seeking more Taiwan investment in the United States, but promoting U.S. investment in Taiwan. On some of my trips to Taiwan, I've gotten to visit, some of the really big ticket, U.S. investments in Taiwan. I even got to put on a clean suit to, one of the space suits to walk around the clean room of one of Micron's newest fabs outside of Taichung. Micron's got a significant amount of investment in its production and semiconductor space in Taiwan. Just to name one company among many that has a lot of different investments there. We're working on continuing to expand our people-to-people ties, which has been a huge a huge backbone of the relationship for so long. Our shared values are such an important element of our friendship and our partnership. But that also includes in things like the education space, where Taiwan sends a lot of international students to the United States. But there's also a tremendous amount that the United States can benefit from in terms of expertise and knowledge from Taiwan, whether that's in the STEM fields, STEM education fields, or whether that's in things like Mandarin language education, broadening and deepening those. I could continue to go down a long list of the things we're expanding, because I think, again, just to continue to demonstrate, our real commitment to Taiwan in many different ways.
Well, Taiwan just elected a new president in January, William Lai, and he's going to enter office in May. Do you expect anything to really change? Because on the one hand, obviously, Vice President Lai is the vice president, and is the DPP will retain the presidency. But on the other hand, it's going to be a split government with the KMT controlling the legislature. Do you expect any major changes in Taiwan's defense policy? Anything that's sort of on your radar in terms of the relationship with the United States and Taiwan? Any major changes coming down the pipeline because of the sort of change in administration coming forward?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, just to note, I've already sort of talked about my love for Taiwan's democracy in the elections, but the U.S. approach throughout Taiwan's election season was really one that was focused on developing strong relationships with each of the candidates and their teams, so that we would be well positioned to work with whomever the Taiwan people elected to be their next leader. And we were, really clear that we don't get a vote in that. That's for the Taiwan people to decide, and we weren't going to take sides. But that we wanted to make sure we had a really strong foundation to work with whomever was elected, so that we would be able to really hit the ground running and continue so much of the really important work that we have underway with our Taiwan friends. And so certainly we feel well positioned with President-elect Lai, the relationship we have with him, the relationship we have with his team. I think people have seen in the past 2 weeks that he has begun naming key officials to his cabinet. The premier, vice premier, a number of the ministers have been named over the past week and a half. We haven't yet seen the public announcements, official announcements of officials on the national security side, but we know those will be coming. And I've had the opportunity in 2 trips since the election to engage with President-elect Lai and members of his team to make sure, again, that we are in a solid place to continue the work going forward. I've also had an opportunity to engage with the new LY. And one of the things that we've heard from the LY, and I heard this, and it was stated publicly by Hung Guoyu, the speaker of the LY, and his deputy Johnny Chong, that they have reached consensus for cross-party support for defense and foreign affairs priorities. And I think that's a really important statement from them. And certainly, just as support for the U.S.-Taiwan partnership is bipartisan here in the United States, we think it's really important that remain cross-partisan in Taiwan, and we'll continue to work to cultivate that. And then the last thing I would say on President-elect Lai is, we've had a lot of really good conversations with him, and he's been really clear in terms of his policy priorities, including his commitment to maintaining the status quo, which we, of course, very much welcome.
Wonderful. And did he elaborate on some of his other priorities? Someone in the Q&A would like to know, beyond just maintaining the status quo in terms of cross-strait relations, in terms of defense policy, and also just in terms of Taiwan's broader diplomatic policy, its economic exchange with other countries. Do you have a sense of where he'll really try to focus his first 100 days, so to speak?
Yeah, I've had an opportunity to engage with him on a number of those topics. I think your audience will probably understand, though, that I'm going to keep our private conversations private and not preempt him in revealing his agenda and let him get inaugurated on
Let him
May
get
20th.
inaugurated first. Yeah, that's
And then be able to roll out what his policy approach is going to be.
fair enough. Well, let's shift gears for a second. So there's obviously a vigorous debate in Washington and really around the world about the fear of a Chinese assault on Taiwan. And some people think that an attack is imminent. Others think that it'll happen maybe next decade after China has had more time to build up its forces. And then there's a whole bunch of other people that think it probably won't happen at all unless the United States or Taiwan does something to provoke China. What's the right way to think about the Chinese military threat? And are there things that Taipei or Washington should really be doing now that they aren't already doing to reduce that threat?
Yeah, thank you. So I will quote, some senior defense officials who have basically stated the view that conflict across the Taiwan Strait is neither imminent nor inevitable. But the United States remains very, very focused on the importance, as I mentioned earlier, of maintaining and reinforcing deterrence across the strait and in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And you've seen that work being borne out again in a lot of the work the United States is doing itself, as well as things that the United States is doing with key allies and partners in the region. I won't elaborate on those in detail, but obviously, just to note recent things, we had Prime Minister Kishida here, as well as a historic trilateral meeting with President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Marcos. And so there were a number of public announcements that came out of those in the defense space that I think are important. And then, as I mentioned earlier, all the work we're doing on, fulfilling our commitments to support Taiwan's self-defense capacity. And this administration, working closely with Congress, has really sought to, again, using the TRA as the foundation, to find ways to use additional tools and authorities in order to be able to get additional defense support, self-defense support to Taiwan. So we've seen the use of foreign military financing for the first time. We've seen the use of presidential drawdown authority, where the Department of Defense actually provides things to Taiwan from its own stocks. Taiwan is now eligible to receive excess defense articles, which is new, and has also received funding under the International Military Education and Training Program, which will importantly allow Taiwan to be able to pursue some of those things at a much discounted rate. All of these things we are thinking about in terms of how can we be doing everything we can, using all the tools we can, and we'll continue to look at creative opportunities and other ways that we could partner with Congress in using both the authorities that I've just named, even more so, or if there are additional authorities to be obtained, thinking about what those might look like. Because again, we think this is a really important thing to make sure, frankly, that we don't see any use of force come to pass. That is, of course, the thing that we all want to avoid. And we know that requires substantial investments in Taiwan self-defense and a deterrence in the region.
So it sounds like a lot of these initiatives will help address what was reported in the media as a backlog of weapons transfers to Taiwan, things that have been ordered several years ago, anti-ship missiles, tanks, drones that could maybe be expedited now. Are you fairly confident that backlog can be broken? And then the one other thing I'd ask you to comment on is, there's this debate about, is there some kind of trade-off between supporting Ukraine militarily and transferring supplies and weapons to Ukrainian forces versus backing Taiwan? The Taiwanese have clearly said they want the United States to do both and to continue to support Ukraine. But, there may be some opportunity costs, and there's certainly prominent strategists in the United States that say the United States doesn't really have the capacity to be supporting major defense efforts in multiple regions and has to focus on one or the other. So how confident are you that some of these new initiatives will prevent things like the backlog that we've heard reported? And are you confident that we can balance the commitments in multiple regions?
Yeah, so on the FMS cases, what I would just note that the Department of Defense has released a strategy focused on the defense industrial base, and I think there's some additional work that's going to be following from that. I think that's also a key element to addressing some of the challenges that you noted, and so I think that will also be an important piece of that. And as I mentioned, while that work is happening, we are doing everything we can with other authorities. In terms of the how Ukraine assistance fits into this, yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody can speak better about this than President Tsai, and she has been really clear on the importance of continuing assistance to Ukraine. And I think then TECRA representative Shelby Kim, now the vice president elect, has also been very public about this on the record. I have heard it very directly from my Taiwan friends as well. And in fact, Michael, you noted earlier when talking about public opinion that in fact one of the things that has in the polls that we see has led to some questioning of U.S. support for Taiwan is in fact waffling on Ukraine aid. And so I think our Taiwan friends don't see this as something that has a trade-off. I think they see it as extremely important that the United States continue to support Ukraine in its effort to defend itself against, Russia's invasion. Certainly, you see the administration's priorities in terms of what the supplemental request was that went up, right? Which included, of course, not only support for Ukraine and Israel, but for the Indo-Pacific. And I'm not going to comment on the votes happening this weekend, but certainly I think we can be sure that our Taiwan friends will be watching.
What about some of the other threats that China may pose to Taiwan? A lot of the focus is on the sort of D-Day style invasion, but China obviously is engaged in a fair amount of political warfare, especially in the lead up to the recent election. You also have other military contingencies, like China perhaps trying to seize some of the offshore islands or trying to conduct a blockade of Taiwan, things that people would say fall into sort of the gray zone. And these can be harder to deter because China might realistically expect a big response from the United States and Taiwan, obviously, if they just straight up assault Taiwan. But if they kind of nibble away or seize an offshore island, they might think that, hey, this is something we can snatch without much of a response from Taiwan or its partners. So how should we be thinking about this type of threat that falls below the spectrum of just full-blown war, and what's the best course for Taiwan working with the United States to counter some of these gray zone operations? I mean, the show of force that China has been sustaining for several years now is the largest in decades, and from my understanding, has been taxing Taiwanese military forces that have to go up and intercept and monitor these Chinese military maneuvers. So, is there anything that the United States can do to help Taiwan deal with some of these shows of force and to try to deter lower level military contingencies as well as the political warfare that we've seen from Beijing?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you point this out. And, we are, very concerned about Beijing's ongoing pressure and coercion campaign against Taiwan, which includes, as you note, a lot of gray zone activity, some of which is in the military space. And I think that tends to get a lot of attention. But as you know, there's political warfare, but there's other, there's economic coercion that we have seen in terms of the PRC targeting certain kinds of, goods or imports and, for particular political outcomes, is sort of their goal. And in cyberspace, we've seen, cyber attacks on Taiwan, some of which have been attributed to the PRC. And we could kind of keep going down the list of the tools that Beijing is using to put pressure on Taiwan on a daily basis. And so I think there's two ways of thinking about the gray zone piece, right? There's the sort of daily pressure and sort of what that does. And then there's how that builds over time and what that could mean. And so I'd say a couple of things here. One, yes, in the military space, certainly a lot of important things to be discussed in terms of ways that Taiwan can think about how to best defend itself and push back on PRC gray zone coercion in the military space. But on the other pieces, it also really points to the need to think about security as beyond just traditional defense in the military sense, and really think more broadly about resilience and how to ensure that Taiwan is as resilient and least vulnerable as possible to these kinds of tools and tactics by the PRC. And I think there's been an increasing amount of focus on this. I know there's been a lot of good research being done by analysts across the think tank and academic community on this. And I think it's an area where there will be an increasing amount of focus for all the reasons that you know, Michael, that this is, a really important thing against the backdrop, of the potential of something, more precipitous, but that we can't ignore both the daily and cumulative effects of the PRC's gray zone activity.
Well, one aspect of that obviously is economic resilience, and you talked earlier about, in particular, the various initiatives the United States has to partner with Taiwan, especially on semiconductors. And semiconductors obviously get a ton of the attention, but Taiwan is one of the top 20 economies in the world and produces a vast range of goods, electronics, materials, chemicals, machinery, outstanding cuisine, among others. And for a long time, though, Taiwan was getting fairly dependent on China's economy. The mainland was absorbing more than 40% of Taiwan's exports for a while. It was responsible for something like 20% or more of Taiwan's imports. In the last year or two, my understanding is that some of that Taiwanese trade dependence on the mainland has declined somewhat as Taiwan has diversified some of its economic partnerships. Do you expect that trend to continue? And can you elaborate on some of these economic initiatives between the United States and Taiwan, or maybe involving some other US allies that may be able to help Taiwan diversify its economic links and build that economic resilience?
Sure. Yeah, I know this is a priority again for many on Taiwan to think about, how to ensure they have, as you said, sort of a diverse and resilient, economy as well as their supply chains. And I think the 21st Century Trade Initiative that we launched is an important element of that. The UK, I believe it was late last year, my timing may be off, also announced their own trade initiative that they're pursuing with Taiwan. A lot of investment opportunities being pursued in a number of different places. TSMC opened or announced the construction of a new fab in Germany, and I think again there will be more to follow in some of those kinds of spaces. I think the challenge, of course, is how Taiwan, the sort of broader regional piece, I think remains a little bit of a challenge. Taiwan, of course, has applied for membership in CPTPP. The U.S. is, of course, not a member of CPTPP, but I think Taiwan does have a desire for broader economic integration in the region. President Tsai had launched a policy she called the New Southbound Policy that was aimed at deepening economic ties, in particular with Southeast Asia. I think we'll see if President-elect Lai aims to either continue that or look to do something, different or otherwise along those lines. But I know we've seen Taiwan kind of trying to think about other ways to diversify its regional economic ties.
As you mentioned earlier, the United States seems to be building out a number of partnerships in East Asia, and you're seeing many US allies, which used to be in this sort of hub and spoke bilateral system, increasingly talking and working with each other. So Japan and the Philippines, Japan and South Korea, obviously AUKUS, the Quad. Do you think that Taiwan, either from an economic perspective and or a military perspective, belongs in some of this broader multilateral security architecture? To the extent that you can talk about this, is it possible to sort of fold in Taiwan to some of these multilateral initiatives, or does Taiwan really have to be run through a close partnership with the United States and then maybe more tangentially with other states in the region?
Yeah, it's obviously something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. We think, the bilateral initiatives, the U.S.-Taiwan initiatives that we're pursuing are the most immediate ways to really robustly develop our economic ties in new and different ways. I think at that point we could see where we could build from there.
Okay. Well, in addition to diplomacy with Taiwan, there's also diplomacy with Beijing, and the United States and Taiwan and China have managed to keep the peace in the Taiwan Strait for decades, sometimes better than others, but overall, we haven't had a war, so that's great. We've talked a lot about why military deterrence is important for that, why economic resilience is important for that. But I'm wondering, what in your mind, what role should diplomacy play in cross-strait relations? And I think it's especially apt, and someone in the Q&A has asked specifically about Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's upcoming trip to China next week to meet with the foreign ministry, perhaps among other folks there. And so I'm wondering, to what extent can the United States help facilitate cross-strait dialogue, or should be involved at all in trying to facilitate cross-strait dialogue? I know American officials will often say we support the idea of cross-strait dialogue, but what does that really mean in practice, and what should the United States be doing to try to make that happen?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So first of all, yeah, I mean, maintaining open lines of communication with Beijing is, of course, a key element of the administration's approach to sort of managing overall competition with Beijing, ensuring that it doesn't veer into conflict. But certainly is important in areas of that are particularly sensitive, or where we have substantial differences. And Taiwan certainly is something that Beijing raises in pretty much every senior level interaction. And I think it's been important to be able to have those open lines of communication, since the Woodside Summit in November, reopening the military to military channels as well, alongside the diplomatic channels with Beijing, I think has been important, again, to ensuring that there isn't any misunderstanding about either side's intentions. The United States has been very clear with Beijing that our policy hasn't changed, that it's remained consistent, that it will continue to remain consistent. And so being able to deliver really direct messages, I think is an important piece. And I expect we will see that continuing. In terms of cross-strait dialogue, yes, the standing position has long been that we support cross-strait dialogue. I think as folks know, of course, Beijing has continued to put certain kinds of conditions on that dialogue. The United States will continue to encourage dialogue to occur. That we think this would be a good thing for peace and stability across the strait. President-elect Lai, in his victory speech in January, I don't have the exact language in front of me, but made comments to the effect about an aspiration to be able to move from confrontation to dialogue. So certainly he's expressed that interest. But I would also just note in this context, without enumerating them, that there are certain kinds of things that inform where our approach on this is and isn't, some of which are outlined in the 6 assurances. And those are also things that we're always very mindful of.
So in addition to that, Taiwan's main opposition party, the KMT, is going to have this legislators delegation visiting China next week. You talked extensively about how Taiwan has this very vibrant, successful democracy, but one aspect of that is you have more than one party, and they're free to engage in various negotiations. And so I'm wondering, to what extent does that either complicate or change the way that the United States has to approach relations with Beijing vis-a-vis Taiwan, where you have different political parties that may be negotiating at different times with Beijing or with Washington? Are there any certain challenges you'd highlight that really come out of the fact that just we're dealing with not a unitary actor, a country that has a vibrant democracy and multiple political parties?
Yeah, well, the good news is the U.S. Policy community is used to dealing with lots of vibrant democracies around the world. So we have experience with that, including, of course, our own vibrant democracy. Look, what I think is important is that we continue to have open communications with all the political parties. In addition, as I mentioned, to seeing the LY leadership when I was in Taiwan 2 weeks ago. I saw Andrew Shaw, the vice chair of the KMT. The chair, Eric Chu, was traveling at the time, but I saw Andrew Shaw then, and then he was here a week later, so I saw him again. So we had a number of opportunities to talk about his recent, prior and upcoming trips to the mainland. As well as when I was in Taiwan recently, I also saw TPP Chair Ko-en-ja, to continue again to just talk with both of them, all parties across the board about the things that the U.S. sees as our priorities, the things that we see as our interests, and understanding where they're at, so that we have a continued dialogue. And again, we think in all democracies, certainly one as important as Taiwan, it's really important for the United States to engage with actors across the political spectrum, and to make sure that, again, our interest is that just as here, we want the U.S.-Taiwan partnership to remain bipartisan, we want the U.S.-Taiwan partnership to remain cross-partisan in Taiwan, because we think that is, again, a really foundational piece of the strength of our partnership.
Well, I know you're very busy, your time is limited. So I'd like to end with the last question, which, you also travel around the United States from time to time. You talk to Taiwanese American communities, but also just broader American citizens. And, if you look at opinion polls or you talk to folks, there are people who are increasingly pro-Taiwan and are fully supportive of it. And there's others who are sort of waffling on what America's role in the world should be broadly, and then specifically with Taiwan. And so I'm wondering, do you have a particular message you would send to them? You talked at the very beginning about reasons why Taiwan matters, but in terms of trying to communicate what's at stake for just the average American who maybe is not plugged in and paying attention to foreign affairs on a daily basis. And if you try to explain, say, the policy of strategic ambiguity or something, or the various communiques, it can be a bit overwhelming the first time you hear about it. So is there a good way that you have found to communicate, why this should matter to even just the average American who maybe feels that, Taiwan is literally on the other side of the world, and shouldn't be one of their top concerns?
Well, I should say in my opening comments, my very long answer on why Taiwan matters, I neglected to mention something that you later mentioned, which is Taiwanese cuisine, which I have to say is, one of the best parts about getting to travel regularly to Taiwan is the amazing food. So I use that as a selling point. No, that's I just wanted to lift that up because, again, it's something that I really love. But in terms of, kind of explaining to the American people, why Taiwan really matters, again, I think some of it is a values proposition. I think some of it is the deep friendship. But again, a lot of Americans really just care about, their trade, the trade relationships, the economic relationships, making sure that, their way of life is protected. And so, frankly, if you pull out sort of any device that you have around you, any electronic device, frankly, even, many other goods, it's amazing how many components are in any given product may come from Taiwan. And I think, again, that's kind of an invisible thread that sort of runs through our economy, especially because of the role that Taiwan plays in providing components for other pieces of things. And I think that's a useful illustration to people of the impact that this really important economy and democracy and the ties that we have that really affect everybody's daily life.
Well, Laura Rosenberger, Chair of the American Institute in Taiwan, thank you so much for being generous with your time. Thanks for your insights and for your service to the country. Best wishes with everything that you're working on.
Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all about all these things, and thanks to everybody for joining.